When you spend your whole life building a home with your own hands, you never expect the people you love most to plot behind your back, yet that is exactly what I discovered. The night my phone buzzed with an alert from my security camera and I opened it to see my son and his wife standing in my living room, whispering with smug little smiles as if the place already belonged to them. "Move everything in, he won't dare say a word. It's time we take this house back," they said. And in that single moment, something inside me went cold because they thought I was thousands of miles away, completely powerless to stop them and completely blind to what they were doing. They thought they could steamroll me, humiliate me, and turn the home I built into their personal nest, while treating me like I was already gone. But what they didn't know was that I had already suspected something was off before I left, and what they really didn't know was that I am not the kind of man who lets betrayal slide. So as they schemed, I prepared a trap of my own. A trap they would walk straight into with full confidence, a trap that would expose every secret, every lie, every greedy intention, and leave them stunned when the truth snapped back at them harder than they could ever imagine. If you think you know how this ends, you don't, because the moment they believed they had won was the exact moment everything began to collapse beneath their feet, and what happened next is something they never saw coming, and something you won't forget once you hear it to the end. My name is Samuel Drayton. I am 70 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 40 years building bridges and highways across 3 states. Now I spend my days in the same house where I raised my son and loved my wife for nearly half a century, a house that still holds her presence in every corner, every shadow, every breath of air that moves through its rooms. 3 years have passed since Evelyn left me, and I still cannot bring myself to change a single thing. Her reading glasses rest on the nightstand where she placed them the night before she went to the hospital for the last time. Her favorite cardigan, the soft blue one with the pearl buttons, hangs over the back of her chair in the living room, as if she might walk in any moment and slip it over her shoulders. Some people would call this unhealthy. Some people have never loved someone for 47 years. The house is quiet now, but it is not empty. Evelyn is everywhere. In the morning light that falls across the kitchen table where we shared 10,000 breakfasts, in the creak of the 3rd stair that she always skipped because it annoyed her, in the white lilies that bloom by the window, her favorite flowers, the ones I promised to tend until my own last day. I water them every evening, just as she did, and sometimes I talk to them the way she used to. I suppose I am really talking to her. I went to the grocery store this afternoon, the same one we visited together every Saturday for decades. Margaret at the register knows me by name. She never comments when I hand her Evelyn's old bank card, the one with her name embossed in faded silver letters. The account was converted to mine after she passed, but I never requested a new card. I cannot explain why seeing Evelyn M. Drayton on that small piece of plastic brings me comfort, but it does. It feels like she is still here, still part of our daily routines, still buying the bread and milk and flowers that fill our home. Our home. I still say it that way, even though she is gone. I suspect I always will. Tonight, after watering the lilies, I paused in front of the bookshelf in the hallway. My eyes drifted to the wooden chest on the top shelf, Evelyn's memory box, she called it. She kept it locked, and I never asked what was inside. Everyone deserves their private corners, even in a marriage as close as ours. She told me once that it held important things, and I trusted that when the time came, I would understand. But she died before that time arrived, and now the box sits there like a question I am afraid to answer. Beside it rests a thick folder labeled Private ED in her careful handwriting. I have not touched that either. The grief is still too heavy. Perhaps it always will be. I settled into my chair by the window as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long golden shadows across the living room floor. Evelyn's photograph watched me from the mantel, our wedding portrait, both of us so young and certain that life would be kind. I raised my glass of water to her image, as I do every evening. "Another quiet day, sweetheart," I said softly. "Nothing changes here. Just the way you left it." But I was wrong. My phone buzzed on the side table, startling me. I am not accustomed to messages at this hour. Derek, my son, rarely contacts me except for holidays and the occasional awkward birthday call. Our relationship has grown distant in recent years since he married Vanessa, if I am being honest. I picked up the phone and read the words glowing on the screen. "Dad, we need to talk about your house. Vanessa and I are coming tomorrow." I stared at the message for a long moment, reading it twice, then a third time. My house. Not your place or home or even the family house. My house. And they were coming tomorrow, not asking if it was convenient, not wondering if I had plans. Coming, as if the decision had already been made. I set the phone down slowly and looked at Evelyn's photograph again. Her eyes seemed different now, less peaceful, more watchful. A warning I could not yet name settled into my chest like cold water. Something was about to change. I could feel it the way old bones feel a coming storm. They arrived at 11 the next morning, earlier than I expected. I had barely finished my second cup of coffee when I heard the car pull into the driveway, not Derek's old sedan, but something newer, sleeker, the kind of vehicle that announces its price before its purpose. I watched from the window as Vanessa stepped out first, not waiting for Derek, her heels clicking against the concrete with the sharp rhythm of someone who believes the world should move at her pace. I opened the door before they reached the porch, hoping to greet them with the warmth a father owes his only son. But Vanessa pushed past me into the foyer before I could say a word, her eyes sweeping across the room like an appraiser calculating value. Derek followed a few steps behind, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed somewhere near my shoes. "It smells old in here, Dad," Vanessa announced, wrinkling her nose as if she had stepped into something unpleasant, like stale. "When was the last time you opened a window?" The words landed harder than she could have known. This was how Evelyn's home smelled to her. The lavender sachets my wife had placed in every closet, the cedar from the chest where she kept her winter blankets, the faint trace of her perfume that I imagined still lingered in the fabric of the curtains. To Vanessa, it was stale. To me, it was everything I had left. "The house is fine," I said quietly, closing the door behind them. "Can I offer you some coffee? Tea?" "We're not staying long," Vanessa replied, already moving into the living room, her fingers trailing across surfaces as if checking for dust. "We just wanted to talk about a few things. Important things." Derek stood awkwardly near the hallway, still not meeting my eyes. He had gained weight since I last saw him, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. My son looked like a man carrying a burden too heavy for his frame. "Derek," I said, reaching out to clasp his shoulder. "It's good to see you, son." He flinched slightly at my touch, then forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "You too, Dad. The place looks the same. Your mother would have wanted it that way." Something flickered across his face, guilt, perhaps, or grief, but it vanished before I could name it. Vanessa called from the living room, and he moved toward her voice like a dog responding to a whistle. We sat in the living room, Vanessa and Derek on the sofa, me in my usual chair by the window. The lilies caught the morning light, their white petals glowing like small prayers. Vanessa glanced at them with obvious disinterest before launching into what I now understand was a rehearsed speech. "Dad, we've been thinking about your situation," she began, crossing her legs and leaning forward with practiced concern. "This house is so big for one person. All these stairs, all this maintenance. Derek and I worry about you being here alone." "I'm not alone," I said. "I have neighbors, friends from church. Lillian next door checks on me every few days." Vanessa's smile tightened. "That's sweet, but we're talking about your future. The market is incredible right now. Houses like this are selling for twice what they were worth 5 years ago. You could downsize to something smaller, more manageable. A nice apartment, maybe. Assisted living, even." "I don't need assistance," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I've lived in this house for 45 years. I intend to die in it." Derek shifted uncomfortably beside his wife. "Dad, it's just, the market conditions are really favorable right now. Vanessa knows a realtor who could get you top dollar. You'd be set for life." "I'm already set for life," I said. "Your mother made sure of that." The mention of Evelyn seemed to irritate Vanessa. She stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt. "Where's your bathroom, Dad? I need to freshen up." "Down the hall, second door on the left." She disappeared down the corridor, her heels echoing against the hardwood. Derek and I sat in silence for a moment, the space between us filled with words neither of us knew how to say. He asked about my health, about the garden, about whether I was still doing the crossword every morning. Surface questions, safe questions, the kind of questions you ask when you are trying to fill time rather than build connection. I answered politely, but my attention had drifted elsewhere. After a break-in on our street last year, I had installed a small security system, nothing elaborate, just cameras in key areas connected to an app on my phone. I had not thought about it in months, but something about Vanessa's behavior made me glance at the device resting on the side table. I watched her move through my home on the small screen, not toward the bathroom, but toward my bedroom. She opened the closet door. She photographed my safe with her phone. She measured the window frames with her hands, counting silently. Then she typed rapidly on her phone, sending messages to someone I could not see. My heart turned cold, but my face revealed nothing. 40 years of negotiating contracts with difficult men had taught me to hide my reactions. When Vanessa returned, her smile was brighter than before, as if she had found exactly what she was looking for. I noticed then the bracelet on her wrist, gold links studded with small diamonds, expensive and new. It was not a family piece. It was not a style Evelyn would have ever chosen. "That's a beautiful bracelet," I said casually. Vanessa's hand flew to her wrist, covering the jewelry with her sleeve. "Oh, this? Just something I picked up. Nothing special." She laughed, but the sound was brittle. They left 20 minutes later, offering hollow promises to visit again soon. I walked them to the door and watched from the porch as they moved toward their car. They thought I could not hear them. They were wrong. Vanessa leaned close to Derek, her voice low but clear in the morning stillness. "Just follow the plan. He won't last long anyway." Derek said nothing. He simply nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. I stood on the porch until their car disappeared around the corner, my hands steady, my mind racing. The woman my son had married was not here to check on me. She was here to take everything I had built, and she believed I was too old to stop her. I did not sleep well that night. Vanessa's words echoed through my mind like a warning bell that would not stop ringing. He won't last long anyway. What did that mean? Was she speaking of my age, my health, or something far more deliberate? I lay in the darkness of my bedroom, staring at the ceiling, and made a decision. I would not confront them. Not yet. A bridge does not reveal its weakness until it collapses, and neither would I reveal mine until I understood exactly what I was facing. 2 days later, I called Derek to tell him I was planning my annual trip to visit Evelyn's grave. Her family plot is located in a small cemetery 3 states away, near the town where she grew up. I have made this pilgrimage every year since she passed 5 days of travel, reflection, and the quiet grief that never fully fades. It is the one journey I take alone, the one ritual that belongs only to her and me. Derek's reaction surprised me. Instead of his usual indifference, he was enthusiastic. "That's a great idea, Dad. You should definitely go. In fact, let us help you with the arrangements." Before I could respond, Vanessa had taken the phone. "We'll book your bus ticket, Dad, and we can pack your bag if you want. You shouldn't be stressing over details at your age. Oh, and don't worry about the house. Derek and I will check on it while you're gone. Water the plants, bring in the mail, that sort of thing." Their eagerness felt rehearsed, like actors who had practiced their lines too many times. I thanked them politely and said I would handle my own packing, but I accepted their offer to book the ticket. I wanted to see how quickly they would move once they believed I was out of the way. The ticket arrived by email within the hour. 5 days, plenty of time for whatever they were planning. The morning of my departure, I woke before dawn and moved through the house with quiet purpose. I checked every window lock, every door latch. I photographed the contents of my safe and emailed the images to myself. And then I did something I had never done before. I activated the security cameras to record continuously, storing the footage to a cloud server that only I could access. The system was simple, installed after a break-in on our street, but I had never used it for more than occasional monitoring. Now it would become my witness. I told no one. Not even Lillian. Lillian Brooks has been my neighbor for 30 years. She and Evelyn were close friends, the kind of women who shared recipes and secrets over the backyard fence. At 74, Lillian is sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, with the instincts of someone who has seen enough of life to recognize trouble when it walks through the door. She caught me as I was loading my small suitcase into the taxi. "Samuel, wait." She hurried across her lawn, still in her housecoat, her white hair pinned back in curlers. "I need to tell you something." I glanced at the taxi driver, who was checking his phone with the patience of a man paid by the hour. "What is it, Lillian?" She lowered her voice, glancing toward my house as if someone might be listening. "Last night I heard them talking on your porch. That woman and your son, they didn't know my window was open. What did they say?" Lillian's face tightened with concern. Something about timing. and paperwork. She kept saying they had to move fast, that everything needed to be ready before you got back. She gripped my arm with surprising strength. Samuel, I don't trust that woman. Never have. Evelyn didn't either, God rest her soul. She told me once that Vanessa had eyes like a calculator, always adding up what things were worth. I patted her hand gently. Thank you, Lillian. I'll be careful. You call me if you need anything, she insisted. Day or night, I mean it. I promised I would, though I had no intention of involving her in whatever was coming. Some battles must be fought alone, at least until you understand the shape of the enemy. The taxi pulled away from the curb at 7:15. I watched my house shrink in the rearview mirror, the white lilies visible in the front window, Evelyn's cardigan still draped over her chair. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked like home. 40 minutes later, halfway to the bus station, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a message from Derek, perhaps a final performance of concern. Instead, the screen displayed an alert from my security system. Movement detected. Living room. 3 persons entering. I checked the timestamp. They had waited less than an hour. I told the taxi driver to pull over at a gas station and open the camera app with steady hands. The footage was clear, captured in the bright morning light streaming through my windows. Derek and Vanessa entered first, followed by a third person, a man I did not recognize, carrying a toolbox, a locksmith perhaps, or something worse. Vanessa moved through my living room like she already owned it, pointing at walls, gesturing toward the hallway that led to my bedroom, my safe, my memories, everything Evelyn and I had built together. I closed the app and stared out the window at the empty road ahead. They thought I was gone. They thought I was a helpless old man making a sentimental journey to his wife's grave. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I asked the taxi driver to take me to the nearest rest stop instead of the bus station. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror with the mild curiosity of someone who had learned not to ask questions, then changed course without comment. I needed to see what was happening in my home. I needed to understand the full scope of what my son and his wife were doing. The rest stop was nearly empty at that hour, just a few truckers refueling and a family stretching their legs by the vending machines. I found a bench away from the noise, sat down with my phone, and opened the security app. My hands were steady. My heart was not. The footage played in real time, crisp and clear. The living room camera showed Derek and Vanessa moving through my home with the confidence of people who believed they would never be caught. The third person, the man with the toolbox, was indeed a locksmith. I watched as he knelt before my bedroom safe, the one where I kept important documents, some cash, and the few pieces of jewelry Evelyn had treasured most. Within minutes, he had it open. Vanessa pushed him aside before he could even stand. She rifled through the contents with quick, practiced hands, pulling out folders and envelopes, photographing each document with her phone. My will, the deed to the house, bank statements, insurance policies. She captured everything, her face illuminated by the phone's glow, her expression one of cold satisfaction. Move everything into the master bedroom, she called over her shoulder to Derek. He's too old to fight back. By the time he figures out what happened, it'll be done. Derek stood near the hallway, holding a cardboard box filled with what appeared to be their belongings. His face was pale, his posture that of a man who had swallowed something bitter and could not spit it out. He hesitated, looking toward the window as if hoping for an escape that would not come. Derek. Vanessa's voice sharpened like a blade. Don't go soft on me now. We talked about this. You agreed. I know, he said quietly. You just nothing. Pick up the box, move it to the bedroom, now. He dropped his head and obeyed, carrying the box down the hallway where I had walked every morning for 45 years, where Evelyn had padded in her slippers to wake me with coffee and quiet conversation. My son was helping a stranger occupy the space where his mother had lived and died. I felt something inside me harden, calcify into a resolve I had not known I possessed. The locksmith left after receiving a stack of bills from Vanessa. She did not thank him or even look at him as he departed. Once he was gone, she pulled out her phone and made a call. The camera's microphone was sensitive enough to capture her words, each one landing like a hammer against glass. Mom, we're in. She laughed, the sound bright and careless. This one's bigger than the last one. The house alone is worth $500,000. Easy. And you should see the paperwork he's got accounts I didn't even know about. She paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. Her mother, apparently. A woman who had raised a daughter to prey on old men. Don't worry. I know what I'm doing. Same playbook. Get control of the finances, establish residency, wait for the right moment. Another laugh. He thinks I'm here to water his plants. By the time he gets back, we'll have everything in place. Same playbook. The words burned through me. This was not the first time Vanessa had done this. There had been others, other homes, other families, other men who had trusted too easily and lost everything. Derek returned from the bedroom, his shoulders slumped, his eyes avoiding the camera as if he somehow knew he was being watched. Vanessa ended her call and turned to him, her smile sharp and triumphant. After this week, this place is ours, she said, gesturing around the living room at Evelyn's lilies, at the photographs on the mantel, at the chair where I had sat every evening for decades, just like your friend's dad's house was supposed to be, except this time, nobody's going to stop us. Derek said nothing. He simply nodded. A puppet whose strings had been pulled so many times, he no longer remembered how to stand on his own. I closed the app and sat very still on that bench, the sounds of the rest stop fading into distant noise. The bus to Evelyn's grave would leave without me. The pilgrimage I had made every year since her death would have to wait. My wife had spent her final months trying to protect me from something I could not see. Now I understood why, and I would not let her effort be wasted. I called for another taxi and gave the driver an address he did not expect, a law office downtown, where an old friend of Evelyn's still practiced. It was time to stop watching and start fighting. The taxi dropped me at a brick building downtown, the kind of solid, unpretentious structure that spoke of decades of quiet competence. The brass nameplate beside the door read Whitmore and Associates, attorneys at law. I had been here only once before, years ago, when Evelyn and I updated our wills. Now I returned alone, carrying evidence of a betrayal I had never imagined possible. Grace Whitmore met me in her office on the second floor. At 62, she carried herself with the kind of calm authority that comes from decades of navigating other people's worst moments. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes, sharp and assessing, softened when she saw me standing in her doorway. Samuel. She rose from her desk and clasped my hand in both of hers. I was so sorry to hear about Evelyn. She was one of the finest women I ever knew. She thought the world of you, too, I said. That's why I'm here. I need your help, Grace. Something is happening, and I don't know how to stop it alone. She gestured to a chair across from her desk and closed the door. Tell me everything, I told her. I showed her the footage on my phone, Vanessa directing operations, the locksmith opening my safe, my son carrying boxes into the bedroom where his mother had taken her last breath. I played the audio of Vanessa's phone call, her casual laughter as she described the playbook to her mother. When I finished, Grace sat in silence for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Samuel, she said finally, her voice harder than I had ever heard it, this isn't just family drama. What you're describing is elder financial exploitation. It's a federal crime. If they're forging documents, accessing your accounts, or attempting to take control of your assets without consent, we're talking about serious felony charges. I suspected as much, I said, but I don't know what to do. If I go home and confront them, they'll deny everything. They'll say I'm confused, that I misunderstood. Worse than that. Grace leaned forward, her hands folded on the desk. If you confront them now, they'll destroy evidence. They'll claim you're senile, that you invited them to stay, that the whole thing is a misunderstanding. I've seen it happen before. The victim comes forward too early, and the predators walk free because there isn't enough documentation to prove intent. So what do? You let them dig deeper. Her words were precise, deliberate. This state has one-party consent laws for recording. That means everything your cameras captured in your own home is admissible in court. You have the right to monitor your property, and you have the right to document crimes committed against you. But right now, you have footage of them moving in and opening your safe. That's damning. But a good defense attorney could argue they were acting on your behalf, checking on the house as promised. They weren't acting on my behalf. I know that. You know that. But a jury needs proof of criminal intent, not just suspicious behavior. If you stay quiet and let them believe they're succeeding, they'll get bolder. They'll forge signatures, move money, maybe even try to have you declared incompetent. And when they do, we'll have everything we need to bury them. The word bury hung in the air between us. Grace was not speaking of graves. She was speaking of justice, the slow and methodical kind that leaves no room for escape. What about my assets? I asked. If they're already photographing my documents, I'll file emergency asset protection papers this afternoon, she said, quietly. The bank will flag any unusual activity on your accounts, and no transfers over a certain amount will be processed without your explicit authorization in person. They won't know anything has changed until they try to move money and find the door locked. I nodded slowly, absorbing the plan. It required patience, something I had learned through decades of engineering, of waiting for concrete to cure and steel to settle before testing the load. I could be patient. I could watch and wait and let them destroy themselves. Grace picked up a pen and pulled a legal pad toward her. One more thing, Samuel. I want to run a background check on your daughter-in-law. What's her maiden name? The question stopped me cold. I opened my mouth to answer and found nothing there. 8 years. Vanessa had been part of my family for 8 years, and I did not know the name she was born with. I had never asked. I had never thought to ask. I don't know, I admitted, the words heavy with shame. She's always just been Vanessa Drayton. Grace's pen paused above the paper. She looked at me with an expression I could not quite read, part sympathy, part professional concern. That's not uncommon, she said carefully. Many people never think to ask, but it matters now. I've seen cases like this before, Samuel. Women who marry into families specifically to exploit elderly parents. They target widowers, single fathers, anyone with assets, and a son who can be manipulated. If Vanessa has done this before, there will be a trail sealed records, dismissed lawsuits, families who were too ashamed to press charges. She set down her pen and met my eyes direct. I'll find it, Samuel. Whatever she's hiding, I'll find it. And when I do, we'll make sure she never does this to anyone else again. I returned 2 days earlier than expected, but I did not go home. Instead, I asked the taxi to drop me at Lillian's house, approaching from the back alley, so that anyone watching my property would not see me arrive. Lillian met me at her kitchen door with a mixture of relief and alarm, ushering me inside before the neighbors could notice. I knew something was wrong, she said, wringing her hands as I settled into her guest room. I've seen them coming and going at all hours, moving furniture, bringing boxes. That woman acts like she already owns the place. She thinks she does, I replied, pulling out my phone. But she's wrong. For the next 2 days, Lillian and I became unlikely partners in surveillance. Her guest room faced the side of my house, offering a clear view of the driveway and front porch. More importantly, her Wi-Fi signal was strong enough for me to monitor my security cameras in real time. We sat together at her small dining table, watching the footage on my tablet, documenting every incursion with timestamps and notes. Vanessa had grown comfortable in my absence. She walked through my home barefoot, leaving dishes in the sink, rearranging furniture to suit her preferences. She had moved Evelyn's cardigan from the chair and stuffed it into a closet. She had relocated the lilies from the window to a dark corner where they would surely die. Each small violation was a message. This is mine now. Derek remained a shadow, following her directions without comment, his face a mask of exhausted resignation. I watched my son carry my belongings into the garage, stack my books into boxes, and strip the photographs from the walls. He never smiled. He never argued. He simply obeyed. A man who had surrendered his will so completely that obedience was all he had left. On the third day, I decided it was time to return home. I called Derek that morning and told him my trip had been cut short due to bad weather. He sounded nervous, stumbling over his words. But Vanessa quickly took the phone and assured me everything was fine. We've been taking such good care of the house, Dad. You'll be so pleased. I arrived by taxi an hour later, walking up to my own front door like a visitor. Vanessa greeted me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Dad, welcome home. You look tired. Was the trip exhausting? Oh, you know how buses are, dear, I said, letting my voice tremble slightly. All that sitting. My back isn't what it used to be. I played my role carefully, confused, forgetful, easily overwhelmed. I called Vanessa dear with every sentence and asked Derek the same question twice, pretending not to remember his first answer. I shuffled instead of walked. I squinted at objects as if my vision was failing. Every gesture, every hesitation was designed to make them believe I was a feeble old man losing his grip on reality. It worked. Vanessa's contempt, which she had kept hidden behind polite smiles, now surfaced openly. She stopped saying please and thank you. She interrupted me mid-sentence. She rolled her eyes when I repeated myself, exchanging glances with Derek that said, "See, he's already losing it." By evening, she had grown bold enough to make her first direct demand. "Dad, we need to talk about the sleeping arrangements," she announced, standing in the doorway of my bedroom, the room I had shared with Evelyn for 45 years. "This room has the best light, and I've been suffering terrible migraines lately. The den would be much more suitable for you. It's smaller, quieter, better for someone your age." I looked at her, then at Derek, who stood behind her with his eyes fixed on the floor. My son said nothing. He did not defend me. He did not even look at me. "Of course, dear," I said softly. "Whatever makes you comfortable." I moved my things to the den that night, carrying my pillow and a few clothes while Vanessa supervised from the hallway. She did not offer to help. Neither did Derek. I shuffled past them with my head bowed, the picture of defeat, while my camera recorded every moment. The next afternoon, while pretending to nap on the den's small couch, I heard Vanessa leave for the grocery store. I waited until her car disappeared down the street, then moved silently through my own home like a stranger. On the kitchen table, partially hidden beneath a stack of mail, I found what I had been dreading: a document, professionally formatted. The heading read, "Power of Attorney, Samuel J. Drayton." Below the legal language, at the bottom of the page, was my signature, clear and confident, exactly as I had signed 1,000 documents over my career. Except I had never signed this one. The forgery was skillful. Someone had studied my handwriting carefully, replicating the slight rightward slant, the way I crossed my T's, the flourish on the final letter of my last name. A busy clerk would accept it without question. A distracted notary might stamp it without a second glance. With this document, Vanessa could control my finances, sell my property, make medical decisions on my behalf. She could put me in a facility and drain my accounts while I sat helpless, declared incompetent by the very signature she had stolen. I photographed the document from multiple angles, then returned it exactly as I had found it. My hands were steady. My heart was ice. That evening, as I sat in the den pretending to watch television, my phone buzzed with an alert. I glanced at the screen, expecting another motion notification from my cameras. Instead, I read words that made my blood run cold. Attempted login to account of deceased holder, Evelyn M. Drayton. Location, your home address. They were no longer content with stealing from the living. Now they had come for my wife's memory as well. I did not sleep that night. The alert about Evelyn's account glowed on my phone screen until dawn, a cold blue light in the darkness of the den. Someone in my own home was trying to access my dead wife's financial records, using information they could only have obtained by rifling through my safe, through her personal documents, through the private papers I had guarded for 3 years. The violation was beyond theft. It was desecration. The next morning, I told Vanessa I needed to visit my doctor for a routine checkup. She barely looked up from her phone, waving her hand dismissively. "Take your time, Dad. Don't rush on our account." The contempt in her voice no longer surprised me. I had become invisible to her, a piece of furniture she would soon dispose of. Instead of the doctor's office, I went directly to the bank. Sandra Lowell had been the branch manager for over a decade. At 55, she projected the kind of professional competence that put anxious customers at ease, warm but precise, friendly but thorough. I had dealt with her many times over the years, and she had personally helped me navigate the paperwork after Evelyn's death. When I asked to speak with her privately, something in my expression must have communicated the urgency. She led me to her office immediately and closed the door. "Mr. Drayton," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "What can I help you with today?" "I received an alert last night," I began, "about my wife's account. Someone tried to access it." Sandra's professional composure flickered. She turned to her computer and typed rapidly, her brow furrowing as lines of data scrolled across the screen. What she found made her face go pale. "Mr. Drayton, I need to show you something." She angled the monitor so I could see. Over the past 72 hours, there have been multiple attempts to access the frozen account belonging to Evelyn M. Drayton. Whoever is doing this has her full social security number, her date of birth, and her security question answers. They've been trying different password combinations. Where are the attempts coming from? Sandra hesitated, as if the answer pained her to deliver. Your home IP address. Every single one. The words confirmed what I already suspected, but hearing them spoken aloud gave them a weight that pressed against my chest. Vanessa was not merely trying to steal my house. She was systematically attempting to access every asset connected to my family, living or dead. This isn't just fraud, Mr. Drayton, Sandra continued, her voice dropping. Accessing a deceased person's financial accounts using stolen identity information is a federal crime. We're talking about identity theft, wire fraud, potentially even money laundering if funds are moved across state lines. The penalties range from 5 to 10 years in federal prison. Can you prove it's her? I asked. My daughter-in-law. Vanessa Drayton. Sandra's fingers moved across the keyboard again. That's what I wanted to check. When you called yesterday and asked me to flag unusual activity, I also ran a background check on the names associated with your household accounts. She paused, studying the screen with an expression of growing unease. Mr. Drayton, I found something unexpected. What is it? She turned the monitor further toward me. On the screen was a legal document, heavily redacted but still legible in places. There's a sealed court record from Nevada under a different married name, Vanessa Hartley. The case was filed 6 years ago, then dismissed before trial. But the file exists, and someone paid a significant amount of money to have it buried. Sealed records aren't cheap, especially when they involve financial crimes. Vanessa Hartley. The name I had never thought to ask for. The past she had hidden behind a different husband's name. What was the case about? My voice was steady, but my hands had begun to tremble not from age or weakness, but from anger held so tightly it vibrated through my bones. Sandra shook her head. The details are sealed, but the case category is listed as financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. That's legal terminology for elder abuse, Mr. Drayton. Specifically, the financial kind. The room seemed to narrow around me. Elder abuse. She had done this before. My son had married a woman who preyed on old men, and I had welcomed her into my home without ever questioning who she truly was. Can you track every attempt she makes? I asked. Every login, every access request, every transaction she tries to initiate? Sandra nodded slowly. Quietly? Yes. The system logs everything automatically. I can flag her activity without alerting her, and I'll document every attempt for the authorities. But Mr. Drayton, you need to involve law enforcement. This is beyond what a bank can handle alone. I have an attorney working on that, I said. Grace Whitmore. She's building a case. Good. Sandra leaned back in her chair, but her expression remained troubled. There's one more thing I need to tell you. When I ran the background check, I also searched for any connections between Vanessa Hartley and the Nevada case. The plaintiff, the person who originally filed the complaint, was the son of a man named Walter Hartley. I recognized the name. Hartley had been Vanessa's first married name, her first husband's family. What happened to Walter Hartley? Sandra's voice dropped so low I had to lean forward to hear her. He died, Mr. Drayton, 6 years ago, in Nevada, approximately 2 weeks after signing power of attorney over to his daughter-in-law. She paused, letting the weight of the words settle between us. The death certificate lists heart failure as the cause. But here's what troubled me. There was no autopsy. The family declined to investigate further, and the case was closed. I sat very still, processing what she had told me. A man had signed over his legal authority to Vanessa. 2 weeks later, he was dead. And now, sitting in my home, wearing my dead wife's jewelry, sleeping in my bedroom, was the same woman who had stood to inherit everything he left behind. You think she killed him, I said. It was not a question. Sandra met my eyes with the careful gaze of someone who had learned to recognize patterns even when the evidence was incomplete. I think that man trusted his daughter-in-law, and I think that trust cost him his life. I also think you should be very, very careful, Mr. Drayton, because if I'm right about what she's done before, then what she's doing to you isn't just about money. She reached across the desk and placed her hand over mine. It's about eliminating obstacles, and right now, you're the only thing standing between her and everything you own. I returned home that afternoon carrying a weight far heavier than anything I could hold in my hands. Sandra's words echoed through my mind with each step from the taxi to my front door. Eliminating obstacles. The phrase had the cold precision of an engineering term, but it described something far more sinister. Vanessa was not simply stealing from me. She was following a pattern, one that had ended in death before. Vanessa barely acknowledged my return, glancing up from her laptop with a dismissive wave before returning to whatever scheme occupied her attention. Derek was nowhere to be seen. I shuffled past her with my head bowed, playing the role of the defeated old man she expected me to be, and retreated to the den that had become my exile. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of my own home footsteps that were not mine, voices that did not belong, the casual occupation of everything I had built. On the nightstand beside me lay Evelyn's old bank card, the one I had carried in my wallet since her death. I picked it up and traced my thumb across her name, feeling the raised letters beneath my skin. They had tried to access her accounts, not just my accounts, but hers, the money she had saved from decades of teaching elementary school, the small inheritance from her mother, the retirement fund she had never lived to spend. They had used her social security number, her personal information, her identity, as if she were nothing more than a resource to be exploited. As if her life, her memory, her 47 years as my wife meant nothing at all. The violation burned through me like acid. I had tolerated much in the past weeks. I had watched them move into my home, displace my belongings, treat me with open contempt. But this was different. This was not an attack on Samuel Drayton. This was an attack on Evelyn. And that I could not forgive. I looked across the room to where the memory box sat on a shelf I had brought from the bedroom. The small wooden chest had followed me into exile, the one piece of Evelyn's private life I had refused to leave behind. For 3 years, I had kept it sealed, honoring the boundaries she had maintained even in our closest moments. Some things, she always said, were meant to be discovered only when the time was right. The time was right. I lifted the box and set it on my lap, feeling its familiar weight. The brass lock was delicate, tin rather than secure, and the key hung from a small hook on the side where Evelyn had always kept it. My hands trembled as I turned the lock and raised the lid. Inside, I found what I expected. Photographs from our early years together, our wedding day, Derek as a baby, family vacations preserved in faded color, letters I had written her during a business trip to Europe, tied with a ribbon she had saved for decades. Small treasures that told the story of our life, a pressed flower from our anniversary dinner, a ticket stub from the first movie we saw together, a handwritten recipe for the chocolate cake she made every birthday. I lifted each item carefully, reverently, feeling her presence in every object she had chosen to keep. But beneath the memories, hidden at the bottom of the box, lay something I had not anticipated, an envelope. Cream-colored, sealed with care. My name written across the front in Evelyn's elegant script. For Samuel, when you need the truth. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the envelope over in my hands, noting the date written in the corner. 8 months before her death. She had prepared this while she was still healthy enough to write, still strong enough to plan, still determined enough to protect me from something she could see and I could not. I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. My darling Samuel, it began. If you're reading this, something has happened that forced you to look for answers. I prayed this day would never come, that I was wrong about everything, that the suspicions I've carried would prove to be nothing more than a sick woman's paranoia. But I know you. I know your kindness, your patience, your willingness to see the best in people even when the evidence suggests otherwise. I always loved that about you, and I always feared it would be your undoing. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. Vanessa is not who she pretends to be. From the day Derek brought her home, I saw something in her eyes that troubled me, a coldness beneath the charm, a calculation behind every smile. I tried to tell Derek, but he wouldn't listen. He was already under her spell. So I did what you would have done if our roles were reversed. I hired someone to find the truth. My hands began to shake. I've spent the last year making sure you'll be protected. Everything I've learned is in the folder beneath this letter. I wanted to tell you myself, to sit with you and explain what I found. But the doctors say I don't have much time left, and I cannot bear to spend our final months together watching you carry this burden. So I'm leaving it here, in the box you've always respected, trusting that you'll find it when you need it most. I set the letter aside and reached into the box. Beneath where the envelope had rested lay a thick folder, its cover marked in Evelyn's handwriting, Private Investigation Report. Subject, V.H. Vanessa Hartley, the name I had only learned today. My dying wife had spent her final months investigating the woman who was now trying to destroy me. While she was fighting cancer, enduring treatments, saying goodbye to the life she loved, she had also been building a shield around me, one I had never known existed until this moment. I returned to the letter to read its final lines. "Read the report, Samuel. Vanessa has done this before. She married into a family in Nevada, gained their trust, and took everything they had. And the last man who trusted her, her first husband's father, didn't survive. I don't know if she killed him. I don't have proof. But I know what she is, and I know what she's capable of. Please, my darling, be careful. And when the time comes to fight, fight without mercy. She won't show you any." I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest, feeling my wife's love reach across the years, across death itself, to wrap around me one final time. "Thank you, Evelyn," I whispered into the empty room. "I won't let her win." I did not sleep that night. The folder lay open on my lap, its contents spread across the narrow bed like evidence at a trial. Outside, the house grew quiet as Vanessa and Derek retired to the bedroom that had once been mine. But inside the den, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. Page by page, I followed the trail my dying wife had blazed, and with each revelation, the woman my son had married became something far more terrifying than I had imagined. Evelyn had hired a retired detective named Frank Morrison, a former police investigator who specialized in background checks and asset searches. His report was thorough, methodical, and devastating. It began with the basics. Vanessa was born Vanessa Morgan in a small town outside Reno, Nevada. Her childhood records were sparse, her education unremarkable. She had worked a series of low-wage jobs throughout her early 20s, leaving each one under circumstances that were never fully explained. At 23, she married a man named Thomas Hartley. The name struck me like a physical blow. Hartley, the same name Sandra had discovered in the sealed court records, the same name that appeared on a death certificate in Nevada 6 years ago. I continued reading. Thomas Hartley was a mechanic, the only son of Walter Hartley, a 68-year-old widower who owned a successful auto repair business and a fully paid home in the suburbs of Las Vegas. Walter had lost his wife to cancer 5 years before Vanessa entered the picture, a detail the detective had underlined twice. Widower, elderly, financially secure, emotionally vulnerable. The profile was identical to my own. Within 2 years of Vanessa joining the family, Walter's health began to decline. The report included copies of medical records obtained through means the detective did not explain. The old man had been healthy for his age, no heart conditions, no chronic illnesses, nothing that would suggest an imminent crisis. Yet suddenly, he was too weak to manage his own affairs, too confused to make decisions, too frail to live alone. He signed power of attorney to his daughter-in-law on a Tuesday afternoon. The document was witnessed by a notary Vanessa had hired herself. 14 days later, Walter Hartley was dead. The cause listed on the death certificate was heart failure. There was no autopsy. The family, meaning Thomas, under Vanessa's guidance, declined to investigate further. The body was cremated within 48 hours, eliminating any possibility of future examination. The business and the house passed to Thomas as the sole heir, but the detective's notes made clear who actually controlled the assets. Within months, the auto shop was sold. The house followed shortly after. The proceeds vanished into accounts that only Vanessa could access. Thomas filed for divorce a year later. The court records were partially sealed, but the detective had obtained enough to paint a damning picture. Thomas accused Vanessa of financial manipulation, of isolating him from friends and family, of controlling every aspect of their shared life. He claimed she had forged his signature on loan documents, opened credit cards in his name, and systematically drained their joint accounts while he was working double shifts to keep the business afloat. The settlement was swift and quiet. Vanessa walked away with $200,000 and a confidentiality agreement that prevented Thomas from ever speaking publicly about what had happened. The detective's note at the bottom of the page was clinical but chilling. Subject appears to target families with elderly widowed parents and significant assets. Pattern suggests premeditation. Recommend extreme caution. I set down the typed pages and found a handwritten note tucked into the back of the folder. Evelyn's script was weaker here, the letters trembling slightly as if written by a hand that was losing its strength. "Samuel," it read. "I tried to warn Derek before I got too sick. I showed him some of what I found, not everything, just enough to make him question. He wouldn't listen. He said I was jealous, that I had never accepted Vanessa, that I was letting my illness make me paranoid. He chose her over me, over his own mother, and there was nothing I could do to change his mind. My chest tightened as I read her words. So I'm leaving this for you instead. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to fight beside you. But I know you, my darling. I know your strength, even when you doubt it yourself. You will find a way. You always do. Please protect yourself, Samuel, and if you cannot save Derek from his choices, at least save yourself from hers. I love you. I will always love you. Evelyn. I pressed the note to my lips and sat in silence for a long moment, feeling her presence wrap around me like a blanket against the cold. She had known. She had seen the danger coming while she was fighting for her own life, and instead of surrendering to despair, she had built me a weapon, a shield, a truth I could use when the time came. The final page of the report was not a document but a photograph, a grave marker, simple gray granite, standing in a Nevada cemetery beneath a cloudless sky. The inscription read, Walter Hartley, beloved father, 1952 to 2018. Rest in peace. Beneath the photograph, the detective had written a final note in red ink, underlined for emphasis. During routine records search, obtained copy of coroner's preliminary notes. Examiner observed unusual bruising on victim's upper arms and torso, inconsistent with natural death or typical heart failure. Recommended full autopsy to determine cause. Family declined. Case closed without further investigation. No charges filed. I stared at the photograph until my vision blurred. Walter Hartley had been 68 years old. He had trusted his daughter-in-law. He had signed over his authority, believing she would care for him. And 2 weeks later, he was dead, his body marked with bruises that no one had bothered to explain. I was 70. I had trusted my daughter-in-law. I had nearly signed the same document. The only difference between Walter Hartley and me was that my wife had loved me enough to leave a warning, and I intended to make sure her sacrifice was not in vain. The next morning, I gathered everything the videos saved to a flash drive, the bank records Sandra had printed for me, and Evelyn's investigation report, and brought them to Grace's office. She cleared her schedule the moment I arrived, closing the door behind us with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that what I carried was more than paperwork. It was a case. Grace read through the materials in silence, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief to something colder as she turned each page. When she reached the photograph of Walter Hartley's grave and the detective's note about unexplained bruising, she set down the folder and removed her reading glasses. "Samuel," she said slowly, "this isn't a simple exploitation case anymore. What you've brought me describes a pattern of criminal behavior that crosses state lines. Nevada to here, that means federal jurisdiction." She reached for her phone. "I'm calling the FBI." I had expected resistance, perhaps a suggestion to gather more evidence or wait for a clearer opportunity. Instead, Grace moved with the urgency of someone who recognized danger when she saw it. Within the hour, she had connected with a friend at the regional FBI field office, a senior agent named Reyes who specialized in financial crimes against the elderly. Agent Reyes arrived at Grace's office that afternoon. He was younger than I expected, perhaps 45, with sharp eyes and the patient demeanor of a man who had learned to listen before he spoke. Grace presented our evidence while I sat quietly, watching his reaction. "We've been tracking a rise in what we call inheritance predators," Reyes said when she finished. "Individuals who target elderly widowers, specifically men who've lost their wives, who have assets, who are emotionally vulnerable and often isolated from family support. The pattern you've described fits perfectly. Marriage to gain access, isolation of the target, forged documents, and ultimately, control of all assets." "And the death in Nevada?" I asked. Reyes met my eyes directly. "We'll be reopening that investigation. If there's evidence of foul play, we'll find it. But right now, our priority is making sure you don't become the next victim." The plan took shape over the following days. Grace filed emergency asset protection orders, ensuring that no significant transactions could occur without my physical presence and verified signature. Agent Reyes assigned a team to monitor Vanessa's digital activity, tracking her attempts to access accounts and forge documents. And I continued playing my role at home, the confused old man, too feeble to notice the wolves circling his door. Lillian came to Grace's office to provide her official witness statement. She sat at the conference table with her hands folded, her voice steady as she recounted everything she had observed. The late-night movers carrying furniture into my home, Vanessa's casual references to the old man in conversations she thought no one could hear, the contractors who had measured rooms and discussed renovations as if I had already ceased to exist. She talked about him like he was already gone, Lillian said quietly, like it was just a matter of time. Grace recorded every word, building the foundation of a case that would leave Vanessa no room to escape. While organizing the documents from Evelyn's memory box, Grace discovered something I had overlooked in my grief-stricken reading. Tucked beneath the investigation report was a sealed envelope, its edges yellowed with age, marked in Evelyn's handwriting. Property Trust, Drayton Family. Grace opened it carefully, unfolding the legal document inside. As she read, the color drained from her face. "Samuel," she said softly, "did you know about this?" "No. What is it?" "It's a property trust. Evelyn had it notarized 3 months before she died." Grace set the document aside, her expression troubled. "I need to review this fully, but if it says what I think it says, your wife did more than investigate Vanessa. She restructured your entire estate." Before I could ask what that meant, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Mr. Drayton, this is Bill Carpenter. I'm a contractor. Your daughter-in-law hired me to take measurements at your house last week." "Yes, I remember seeing you," I said carefully. "Is something wrong?" A long pause. I could hear the man breathing, wrestling with whatever had compelled him to call. "Look, I don't normally get involved in family business," he said finally. "But something your daughter-in-law said has been bothering me. When I asked about the timeline for the renovation, she told me not to worry about you. She said you'd be out of the picture by next month." My grip tightened on the phone. "I don't know what that means, Mr. Drayton. Maybe she's planning to move you somewhere, or maybe it's nothing. But the way she said it didn't sit right with me. I thought you should know." I thanked him and ended the call, my heart pounding against my ribs. Out of the picture by next month. The same timeline Walter Hartley had faced, the same cold calculation that had ended his life. Grace watched me from across the table, her expression grim. "We need to move faster," she said. "Whatever she's planning it soon." That evening, as I sat in Lillian's guest room reviewing the day's footage, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The words on the screen made my breath catch. "Dad, be careful. Don't trust." The message ended abruptly, as if the sender had been interrupted mid-thought. I stared at the incomplete warning, my mind racing through possibilities. "Dad, only one person called me that." I typed a quick reply asking who this was, but the message failed to send. The number had already been disconnected. I sat in the dim light of Lillian's spare room, turning the phone over in my hands. The message had arrived at 4:47 inches the afternoon. If my cameras had captured anything during that time, I would find my answer there. I opened the security app and scrolled to the timestamp. The kitchen camera showed Derek standing alone by the counter, his back to the doorway, his phone clutched in both hands. His thumbs moved rapidly across the screen, and his shoulders were hunched with the tension of someone doing something forbidden. I watched as he typed, paused, typed again, composing a message he knew could change everything. Then Vanessa appeared in the doorway. Her entrance was silent, predatory. She stood watching Derek for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she registered what he was doing. In 3 quick strides, she crossed the kitchen and snatched the phone from his hands before he could react. Her face contorted with rage as she read the screen. "What is this? What are you doing?" Derek's voice was barely audible, captured by the camera's sensitive microphone. You were warning him." Vanessa's words dripped with venom. "After everything we've planned, everything we've worked for, you were going to throw it all away for that old man? He's my father, Vanessa. He's a mark." She stepped closer, her finger jabbing into his chest. "A means to an end. That's all he's ever been. And if you can't remember that, maybe I need to remind you what's at stake." Derek tried to take back the phone, but she held it out of reach, her smile turning cruel. "You want to play hero, Derek? Fine. Let's talk about your gambling debts. The $80,000 you borrowed from my mother's connections. The men who don't take IOUs and don't accept excuses." The color drained from my son's face. "That's not fair. You said. I said I would handle it. And I have been handling it. But if you try to warn your father again, I'll stop handling it. I'll tell everyone, the bank, the police, your precious daddy. I'll make sure they know that his devoted son has been drowning in debt for years, borrowing from loan sharks, lying to everyone who trusted him. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. You'll go to prison, Derek. Not me, you. And I'll make sure your father knows his precious son is nothing but a fraud. Derek crumbled before my eyes. His shoulders sagged, his head dropped, and when he spoke again, his voice was the broken whisper of a man who had lost everything. I never wanted this, Vanessa. Any of it. He's my father. He doesn't deserve what we're doing to him. For a moment, something flickered across Vanessa's face, not remorse, but calculation. She was assessing the situation, determining how much pressure was needed to keep her puppet in line. He's a paycheck, she said finally, her tone as cold as winter steel. A house, a bank account, an inheritance you've been waiting for your whole life. Don't pretend you're innocent in this, Derek. You came to me with your debts and your problems. You asked me to fix things. This is me fixing things. Not like this. Exactly like this. She grabbed his chin, forcing him to meet her eyes. You don't get to have a conscience now, not after everything we've done. You're in this as deep as I am, and if I go down, you go down with me. Do you understand? Derek said nothing. His silence was its own answer. Vanessa released him and stepped back, smoothing her hair with the casual indifference of someone who had just completed an unpleasant but necessary task. Then, she leaned close to him one final time, her voice barely audible on the recording. Your father signs the POA tomorrow morning. I've already prepared the document. All he has to do is put his name on the line, and this whole thing moves forward exactly as planned. She paused, letting her words sink in. His signature, or your freedom. Choose. She walked out of the kitchen without looking back, leaving Derek alone with his shame. I watched my son stand motionless for a long moment, his hands hanging at his sides, his face a mask of despair. Then he picked up a glass from the counter and hurled it against the wall, where it shattered into 1,000 pieces. He sank to the floor amid the broken shards, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I closed the app and sat in the darkness of Lillian's guest room, feeling something I had not expected. Beneath my anger, beneath my determination to bring Vanessa to justice, a new emotion stirred. Pity for my son, for the weak, frightened man he had become. He had tried to warn me. In that single, desperate moment, he had chosen his father over his wife, and she had crushed him for it. Tomorrow, she expected my signature. Tomorrow, she planned to complete her theft. She would not get what she wanted, but perhaps, if I played this correctly, I could save more than just myself. The morning she expected my signature, I arrived at my own front door with an entourage she never anticipated. Grace walked beside me, her briefcase containing every document we had gathered. Behind us came 2 uniformed police officers from the county sheriff's department, their expressions professionally neutral, and at the rear, moving with the quiet authority of a man who had done this many times before, was FBI Agent Reyes. I did not knock. It was my home. I simply turned the key and walked inside. Vanessa was in the kitchen, seated at the table where Evelyn and I had shared 45 years of morning coffee. She held a mug in her hands, my wife's favorite, the one with the hand-painted lilies that Evelyn's students had given her upon retirement. The sight of Vanessa's lips touching that rim, her fingers wrapped around that precious ceramic, sent a wave of cold fury through me that I buried beneath decades of professional composure. Her shock was immediate and visible. The mug froze halfway to her mouth. Her eyes widened as she processed the uniforms, the badges, the grim faces of people who had not come for a friendly visit. She had expected another week. She had expected me to be confused and compliant, shuffling to the kitchen table to sign away my life. Instead, I stood before her flanked by the law, and for the first time since I had met her, Vanessa Drayton looked afraid. The fear lasted only a moment before it transformed into aggression. What is this? She slammed the mug onto the table and rose to her feet. What are you doing here? This is my home now. She turned to the officers, her voice climbing with practiced hysteria. Officers, this man is mentally incompetent. He's been showing signs of dementia for months. I have medical documentation that proves he can't make decisions for himself. Whatever he's told you is the confusion of a sick old man who... We have documentation too, Grace interrupted calmly. She stepped forward, opened her briefcase, and withdrew her laptop. May I use your television, Mr. Drayton? Please, I said. Grace connected the laptop to the screen mounted on the living room wall, the same screen Vanessa had used to watch her evening programs while occupying my home. Within moments, the footage began to play. The room fell silent. For the next 10 minutes, we watched Vanessa's crimes unfold in high definition. The camera had captured everything. Her directing the locksmith to open my safe, her rifling through documents and photographing each one, her casual dismissal of my humanity as she told Derek I was too old to fight back. We heard her phone call to her mother, laughing about how this one is bigger than the last one. We watched her threaten Derek with exposure, her voice dripping with contempt as she called me a paycheck and nothing more. Every word, every gesture, every moment of cruelty preserved in perfect clarity. Vanessa's face cycled through emotions as she watched denial, then anger, then the dawning horror of someone who realizes they have been caught in a trap of their own making. She tried to speak twice, opening her mouth to offer explanations that died before they could form. There was nothing to explain. The evidence was irrefutable. When the footage ended, Agent Reyes stepped forward. Mrs. Drayton, he said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, we have additional evidence linking you to financial crimes in the state of Nevada, including a reopened investigation into the death of Walter Hartley. You will be facing charges in multiple jurisdictions. The arresting officer moved behind her, his handcuffs already in hand. Vanessa Drayton, you are under arrest for elder financial exploitation, identity fraud, and forgery. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed for you. The handcuffs clicked closed around her wrists, and something inside Vanessa shattered. The composed, calculating woman who had walked into my life 8 years ago vanished, replaced by something raw and desperate and ugly. She twisted against the officer's grip, her eyes wild, her voice rising to a scream. This is a setup. He planned this. That senile old man has been spying on me. She turned her fury toward Derek, who stood frozen in the hallway, his face pale as ash. Tell them, Derek, tell them this was your idea. You came to me. You wanted the money. You said your father had plenty and wouldn't miss it. Derek did not move. He did not speak. Tears streamed down his face as he watched his wife thrash against the officers who held her. Derek! Vanessa's scream echoed through the house that would never be hers. Don't just stand there. Tell them, tell them. But my son had no words left. He had spent years following her commands, obeying her instructions, surrendering his conscience piece by piece until nothing remained but guilt and shame. Now, watching her dragged toward the door in handcuffs, he could only stand witness to the destruction she had brought upon them both. The officers led her outside, her screams fading as they guided her into the waiting patrol car. Through the window, I watched the vehicle pull away, carrying Vanessa Drayton toward a future she had never imagined, one where the predator had finally become the prey. I turned to look at my son, still frozen in the hallway, still weeping. Derek, I said quietly. He flinched at his own name, unable to meet my eyes. We need to talk. The conversation with Derek would have to wait. Before I could take a step toward my son, Agent Reyes touched my elbow and spoke quietly. Mr. Drayton, I need to speak with you and Miss Whitmore privately. There are things you need to know before we proceed further. I looked at Derek, still standing in the hallway like a man who had lost the ability to move. Lillian appeared at the front door she had been watching from her porch, and I nodded toward my son. She understood immediately, guiding him to the living room couch with the gentle authority of a woman who had raised 3 children of her own. He followed without resistance, a puppet whose strings had finally been cut. Grace, Agent Reyes, and I retreated to the den, my temporary bedroom, now returned to its original purpose. The agent closed the door and stood with his back against it, his expression grave. What I'm about to tell you is part of an ongoing federal investigation, he began. Some of this information has not yet been made public, and I need your discretion until we're ready to file formal charges. You have it, I said. Reyes nodded and pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, though I suspected he did not need it. The details were clearly etched in his memory. 6 months ago, the FBI field office in Nevada reopened the file on Walter Hartley's death. His son, Thomas, Vanessa's first husband, had been trying for years to get someone to listen to his suspicions. After the divorce, he became convinced that his father's death was not natural, but he had no proof, and the local authorities had already closed the case. "What changed?" Grace asked. A pharmacy technician came forward. She had worked at a drugstore in Las Vegas during the time Vanessa was married to Thomas. She remembered Vanessa because of an unusual purchase, large quantities of digoxin, a heart medication that can cause fatal cardiac arrhythmia if administered incorrectly. The technician didn't think much of it at the time. Vanessa claimed she was picking it up for her father-in-law, who had a prescription. But Walter Hartley didn't have a heart condition, I said, remembering what I had read in Evelyn's investigation report. Correct. His medical records show no history of cardiac problems and no prescription for digoxin. The pharmacy technician only made the connection years later, when she saw a news story about inheritance fraud and recognized Vanessa's photograph. She contacted us, and we began building a case. Reyes paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Mr. Drayton, we believe your daughter-in-law is what we call an inheritance predator. These are individuals who systematically target vulnerable elderly people, usually widowers with significant assets. They gain access through marriage to adult children, establish trust, isolate the target from outside support, and then take control of finances through forged documents or manipulated legal instruments. In the most extreme cases, when the target becomes an obstacle, they are removed." The clinical language could not soften the horror beneath it. Removed, killed, murdered by someone they had welcomed into their family. "Walter Hartley died 14 days after signing power of attorney to Vanessa," Reyes continued. "The coroner noted unexplained bruising, but the family declined an autopsy. Based on the pharmacy records and the timeline, we believe he was poisoned. We cannot prove it, yet the body was cremated, but the pattern is unmistakable." He looked at me directly, and I saw something in his eyes that was not professional detachment. It was concern. Personal, genuine concern for a man he had only just met. "Mr. Drayton, based on the timeline we've reconstructed from your security footage and financial records, we believe you were approximately 3 to 4 weeks away from a similar health crisis. The forged power of attorney was the final piece Vanessa needed. Once she had legal control of your affairs, there would be nothing to stop her from isolating you completely and eventually ensuring you suffered a convenient accident or sudden illness." I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the full weight of what he was saying pressing against my chest. 3 weeks, perhaps 4. That was how close I had come to joining Walter Hartley in an unmarked grave, my death attributed to old age or heart failure, my assets stripped by a woman who had never seen me as anything more than a target. Grace spoke into the silence. "What about Derek? How much did he know?" Reyes consulted his notebook. "We've obtained records from Sandra Lowell at the bank showing that Vanessa forged Derek's signature on multiple loan documents, putting him $80,000 in debt to individuals connected to organized lending operations. Derek was being blackmailed with those debts he didn't even know existed until Vanessa revealed them as leverage. So he was a victim too," I said quietly. "A victim and an accomplice. The law will have to sort out how much he knew and when. But it's clear that Vanessa was the architect of this scheme, and Derek was more puppet than partner." Reyes stepped closer and placed his hand on my shoulder, a gesture that felt less official than human. "Sir, I've worked financial crimes for 15 years. I've seen families destroyed by people like Vanessa Drayton. Most of the time, we arrive too late. The victim is already gone, the assets already scattered, the predator already moving on to the next target." He paused, his grip tightening slightly. "Your wife's investigation and your patience didn't just save your estate, Mr. Drayton. They may have saved your life." I closed my eyes and saw Evelyn's face, not as she was at the end, weakened by illness, but as she had been for 47 years. Strong, fierce, unwilling to let anyone harm the people she loved. "Thank you," I whispered, though I was not speaking to Agent Reyes. I was speaking to her. When I emerged from the den, the house had grown quiet. Agent Reyes had departed to coordinate with the district attorney's office. Grace had left to begin preparing the legal documents that would protect my assets permanently. Lillian had returned to her own home, her work as witness and guardian complete. Only Derek remained, sitting on the living room couch where his mother had once read him bedtime stories, his head bowed, his hands hanging limp between his knees. He looked up as I entered, and I saw something in his eyes I had not seen since he was a boy, caught in some small mischief, fear, shame, and beneath it all, a desperate hope that his father might still find a way to make things right. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking on the single syllable. "Can we talk? Just us. No cameras, no lawyers. Just you and me." I nodded and crossed to the security panel on the wall, switching off the recording system with a deliberate gesture he could see. Then I lowered myself into my chair, the same chair where I had sat for decades, watching my son grow from infant to toddler to young man to whatever broken thing now sat before me. "Talk," I said. For a long moment, he could not. His jaw worked silently, his eyes filling with tears he seemed unable to control. When the words finally came, they poured out in a flood of grief and guilt that had clearly been building for years. "I knew something was wrong, Dad. I knew from the start." His voice broke, and he pressed his palms against his eyes like a child trying to block out a nightmare. The way she talked about money, about the future, about you, there were signs everywhere, and I ignored them because it was easier than facing the truth. What truth? That I was weak, that I was a coward. He dropped his hands and looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. The gambling started before I met her. Small bets, nothing serious, or so I told myself, but it grew, and I couldn't stop, and before I knew it, I owed people money I didn't have, dangerous people. When Vanessa found out, I thought she would leave me. Instead, she said she could fix it. She said her mother had connections who could make the debts disappear. He laughed bitterly, a sound without humor. They didn't disappear. They just transferred. Suddenly, I owed her family instead of the loan sharks, and Vanessa held that debt over my head like a knife. Every time I questioned what we were doing, every time I tried to pull back, she reminded me what would happen if I didn't cooperate. Prison, disgrace, losing everything, including you. I said nothing. I let him speak, let the poison drain from a wound that had been festering for years. She controlled everything, Dad. Our finances, our schedule, who we saw and who we didn't. She cut me off from my friends, convinced me that you were too stubborn to help us willingly, that we had no choice but to take what we needed. His voice dropped to a whisper. She said we would give you a nice retirement home, somewhere comfortable. She said you would be happier with people your own age looking after you. And you believed her? I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. Tears streamed openly down his face now, because the alternative was admitting that I had married a monster, that I had let her into our family, that everything happening to you was my fault. He broke down completely then, his shoulders heaving with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and damaged inside him. I watched my son cry. This 42-year-old man reduced to the helpless grief of a child who knows he has done something unforgivable. When his sobs finally subsided, I spoke for the first time. "You tried to warn me." Derek looked up, startled, confusion cutting through his tears. "That message you tried to send," I continued. "She deleted it from your phone, but the camera caught you typing it in the kitchen. I saw the footage, Derek. I know you tried." His face crumpled again, but this time with something other than shame. Relief, perhaps, or the first fragile stirring of hope. "I wanted to tell you everything," he whispered. "I wanted to stop it, but I was so afraid of her, of what she would do, of what you would think of me." I rose slowly from my chair, my old bones protesting the movement, and crossed the room to stand before my son. He looked up at me with the eyes of the boy I had raised, the boy who had scraped his knees learning to ride a bicycle, who had cried when his first pet goldfish died, who had once believed his father could fix anything. I reached down and pulled him to his feet. Then I did something I had not done in years. I wrapped my arms around him and held him close, feeling his body shake with sobs against my chest. "You're still my son," I said quietly, my own voice thick with emotion. "Nothing changes that. Nothing ever could." He clung to me like a drowning man grasping a lifeline, his tears soaking into my shirt, his words muffled against my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." I held him tighter, remembering the weight of him as an infant, the trust in his eyes when he looked up at me from his crib. My boy, my only child, flawed and broken, and still, somehow, mine. "Being my son means facing what you've done," I said softly. "The law will have its say. There will be consequences, but you won't face them alone. I pulled back and looked into his eyes. Together. Are you ready? Derek met my gaze, and for the first time in years, I saw something of the man I had always hoped he would become. Together, he whispered. The trial began 3 weeks later, in a federal courtroom that smelled of polished wood and the weight of consequence. Every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall, their notebooks ready, their eyes hungry for the story that had captured national attention. The headlines had already written themselves. Widow's legacy stops. Alleged serial predator. Dying wife's investigation saves husband from inheritance scheme. FBI links suspect to previous death in Nevada. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, my hands folded in my lap, my face carefully neutral. Derek sat beside me, his cooperation with prosecutors having earned him a place as a witness rather than a defendant. He had told them everything, the gambling debts, the manipulation, the threats, and in exchange, the federal charges against him had been reduced to probation and mandatory counseling. He would not go to prison, but he would carry the weight of his choices for the rest of his life. Vanessa sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back, her face stripped of the makeup that had always been part of her armor. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the concrete walls and fluorescent lights of the detention center where she had spent the past 3 weeks. Her attorney, a public defender assigned after her assets were frozen, shuffled papers with the resigned air of someone who knew the battle was already lost. The prosecution presented their case with methodical precision. The videos played on a large screen, showing Vanessa ransacking my safe, mocking my age, threatening my son. Bank records documented her attempts to access Evelyn's frozen accounts. The forged power of attorney was displayed, its false signature magnified for the jury to examine. Agent Reyes testified about the Nevada investigation, the pharmacy records, the suspicious death of Walter Hartley. Each piece of evidence was another nail in a coffin Vanessa had built for herself. Then Grace took the stand. She carried a single document in her hands, the sealed envelope from Evelyn's memory box, now entered into evidence as Exhibit 47. The courtroom grew quiet as she approached the witness stand, her silver hair catching the light, her posture radiating the calm authority of someone about to deliver a final blow. "Miss Whitmore," the prosecutor began, "can you explain to the court what this document represents?" "This is an irrevocable property trust, created by Evelyn Drayton approximately 3 months before her death," Grace replied. Mrs. Drayton, aware that she was terminally ill and concerned about potential threats to her husband's welfare, restructured all family assets, the house, the investment accounts, or retirement funds into this trust. The sole beneficiary during his lifetime is Samuel Drayton. Upon his death, the assets would pass to his son Derek, or to Derek's heirs. "Would pass?" the prosecutor pressed. "Is there a condition?" Grace nodded and opened the document to a marked page. There is a clause that Mrs. Drayton insisted upon including. She called it her protection provision. "May I read it for the court?" "Please do." Grace adjusted her glasses and read aloud, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "If any named beneficiary, or their spouse is convicted of, or pleads guilty to, elder abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, or any felony against Samuel J. Drayton, that beneficiary shall forfeit all inheritance rights permanently. Their share shall transfer in its entirety to the National Center for Elder Abuse Prevention to be used for the protection of vulnerable seniors." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I watched Vanessa's face as the words sank in, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her lips part in silent horror. She had spent 8 years positioning herself to inherit everything I own. She had manipulated my son, invaded my home, forged my signature, and possibly murdered another man in pursuit of wealth that was never hers. And now, with a single clause written by a dying woman, all of it had turned to ash in her hands. She had not just lost her freedom, she had lost everything she was trying to steal. The prosecutor turned to address the bench. "Your Honor, the people have presented conclusive evidence of elder financial exploitation, identity fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit further crimes across state lines. We request the maximum sentence allowed under federal guidelines." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with gray eyes that had seen decades of human failing, reviewed the documents before her. The courtroom held its breath. The defendant, Vanessa Drayton, is found guilty on all counts, she announced, her voice flat and final. Sentencing: 10 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 7 years. Additionally, per the provisions of the Drayton Family Trust, all inheritance rights claimed by the defendant through her marriage to Derek Drayton are hereby revoked. The defendant will have no legal claim to any assets belonging to Samuel Drayton or his estate, now or in the future. She turned to look directly at Vanessa, who sat frozen at the defense table. Mrs. Drayton, you targeted a grieving widower and attempted to steal everything he and his wife had built over a lifetime. You manipulated his son, forged his documents, and based on evidence presented by the FBI, you may have committed similar crimes before crimes that resulted in a man's death. The law has limits on what it can punish, but justice has a longer memory. You will have 10 years to consider what you have done. The bailiffs moved forward. Vanessa rose slowly, her wrists extended for the handcuffs that would accompany her to federal prison. As they led her past the gallery, she turned her head and looked at me, not with anger, not with defiance, but with the hollow emptiness of someone who had finally lost everything. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say. I watched her disappear through the side door, and I felt no triumph. Only the quiet satisfaction of a promise, kept, a promise made by a woman who had loved me enough to fight for me, even after death. 3 months passed before the house felt like home again. The process was slow, deliberate, like the careful restoration of a structure that had been damaged but not destroyed. I moved Evelyn's cardigan back to her chair, exactly where it belonged. I returned the lilies to the window, where the morning light could reach them properly. I took her photograph from the den and placed it on the mantel in the living room, angling it so that the afternoon sun would catch her smile just as it had during all those years when she sat in that very spot, reading or knitting or simply watching me with the quiet contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world. The silence of the house no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like peace. Derek came every Sunday now, arriving in the late morning with coffee and pastries from the bakery Evelyn had loved. He had sold the expensive car Vanessa had insisted they buy, replacing it with a modest sedan that suited his new circumstances. The gambling debts were being repaid through honest work. He had taken a job at a local hardware store, earning far less than his previous career, but sleeping better than he had in years. He attended Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice a week, and on the first Sunday of each month, he reported to a community service center to fulfill the terms of his probation. We did not speak often of what had happened. There was no need. The wounds were too fresh, the memories too raw. Instead, we talked about small things: the weather, the garden, the repairs the old house needed after years of neglect. We rebuilt our relationship the same way I had built bridges throughout my career, one carefully placed piece at a time, testing the load before adding more weight. It would take years before we were fully restored, but we had years. That was more than Vanessa had intended to give us. One evening, after Derek had gone home and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, I found myself drawn once again to the memory box. It sat on the shelf where it had always been, its brass lock polished, its wooden surface warm with the patina of age. I had read through its contents many times since the trial, the photographs, the letters, the investigation report that had saved my life. But tonight, something compelled me to look deeper. I lifted out each item carefully, setting them aside on the table. When the box appeared empty, I noticed something I had missed before: a slight unevenness in the bottom, a gap where the wood did not quite meet the sides. My engineer's instincts awakened. I pressed gently on one corner, and the false bottom lifted away, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside lay a single envelope, small and cream-colored, with my name written in Evelyn's hand. My heart stuttered as I lifted it from its hiding place. This was not part of the investigation. This was not a warning or a weapon. This was something she had kept separate, secret, waiting for me to find when the time was right. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers and unfolded the letter inside. It was not dated. It simply began with words that reached across death itself to embrace me. My darling Samuel, if you're reading this, you've survived. I knew you would. I had to stop and wipe my eyes before I could continue. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything face to face. I was afraid that if you knew what Vanessa was planning, you would confront them before you were ready, and I would lose you too. So I left you the tools to fight, and I trusted you to find them when the time came. You always were the most patient man I ever knew. It's one of the 1,000 things I loved about you." The letter continued, her voice so clear I could almost hear her speaking beside me. "The cabin by the lake is still waiting for us. Do you remember how we used to talk about retiring there someday, spending our final years watching the water and counting the birds? I won't be there in body, my love, but I'll be there in every sunrise, every breeze, every moment. You choose peace over pain. Go there, Samuel. Live there, be happy there, for both of us." The final lines blurred through my tears. I'm not sorry for loving you for 47 years. I'm not sorry for fighting to protect you, even when I was too weak to lift my own head. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Samuel Drayton. And wherever I am now, I'm still watching over you. Forever yours, Evelyn. I pressed the letter to my chest and sat in silence as the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. The light fell across Evelyn's photograph, illuminating her smile, making it seem almost alive. I rose slowly and walked to the window, where the lilies bloomed in the fading light. Outside, the world was settling into evening, the soft chirp of crickets, the rustle of wind through the old oak tree, the distant sound of children playing somewhere down the street. Life continuing, as it always does. "Thank you, sweetheart," I whispered to the empty room, to the photograph, to wherever she might be, for everything. A flutter of wings caught my attention. A cardinal landed on the windowsill, its red feathers brilliant against the darkening sky. Evelyn's favorite bird. She had always said they were messengers from those who had passed on, carrying love across the divide between worlds. The cardinal turned its head and looked at me with one bright eye. Then it sang once a clear, sweet note that seemed to hang in the air like a blessing and flew into the fading light. I watched and finally, truly, mine again. Some battles are not won with anger or vengeance. They are won with patience, with truth, and with the love of someone who refuses to let you face the darkness alone. Evelyn Drayton could not be there to protect her husband in person, but she found a way to shield him from beyond the grave, leaving behind the tools he would need to survive a predator who had already claimed one victim and was preparing to claim another. Samuel Drayton was 70 years old when his world was turned upside down. He could have given up. He could have surrendered to the confusion and despair that Vanessa had planned for him. Instead, he remembered who he was, an engineer who had spent his life building things that lasted, a husband who had loved one woman for 47 years, a father who still believed his son could find redemption. He fought back not with fists or fury, but with evidence, with patience, and with the quiet determination of a man who had everything to lose and refused to let it slip away. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that strength comes in many forms and that love can reach across even death itself, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below and tell me what you thought. Did Samuel make the right choice in forgiving Derek? What would you have done in his place? Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story. And remember, no matter how old you are, no matter how alone you feel, you are never too weak to fight for what is yours. Thank you for listening. Until next time.